We have stumbled upon this book from the University of Michigan Studies Humanistic Series, Volume 13. Fragments from the Cairo Genizah or Genizah in the Freer collection. We had no idea what a Genizah or a Genizah is, so that made it quite interesting. So we decided to read it to find out. It was edited by Richard Gothiel, Columbia University, and William H. Worrell, University of Michigan, and published around 1927. Preface. The documents from the Cairo Genizah published in this volume were obtained by Mr. Charles L. Freer in Egypt in 1908. They now form a part of the collections in the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., USA. In December 1906, Mr. Freer had purchased at Giza the now well-known Greek manuscripts of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Gospels and the Psalms, and fragments of a manuscript of the Epistles of Paul. A report upon them was made by Professor Henry A. Sanders at the meeting of the Archaeological Institute of America in Chicago at the end of December 1907. Much interest was aroused, and since it seemed probable that the manuscripts had been found in the ruins of a monastery and had formed a part of a monastic library, Mr. Freer resolved to spare no effort to obtain other portions of the same collection in case such should have been brought to light. With this in mind, he made a special trip to Egypt in 1908. The most diligent inquiry, however, failed to elicit information that would lead to the recovery of other Greek manuscripts of value. But in his quest, Mr. Freer did secure some Coptic parchments in which was included a Psalter and a Genizah or Genizah fragments. The Coptic Psalter was handed to this particular writer of this preface by Mr. Freer in Detroit on September 15, 1908. A few days later, his curator brought to this writer at the University of Michigan the remaining Coptic leaves in the Genizah or Genizah documents. All this material was at once examined by Dr. William H. Worrell. The Coptic Psalter and the other leaves afterwards were published by Mr. Worrell in Volume 10 of the Humanistic Series of the University of Michigan Studies. In the same series, Volumes 8 and 9, Mr. Sanders had already published the Greek manuscripts. Learning of the presence of the Genizah or Genizah documents in Detroit and appreciating, as few scholars would, their value as source material for the history of an obscure but important period, Professor Richard Gothiel in 1912 undertook to prepare them for publication. He had accomplished the extremely difficult task of transcribing the text when the war broke out. It would be World War I. Responding to the call of duty with much personal sacrifice and risk to health, he devoted himself to humanitarian work in New York, USA until the armistice and beyond. Peace was made at the end of the war, right? Resuming his preparation of the Genizah material as soon as possible, he finished the first draft of the translation of nearly all the documents and had commenced the preparation of notes. With an accumulation of work, due to having been called to spend an academic year at the University of Strasbourg, obliged him to ask to be relieved from further responsibility for the completion of the volume. Very reluctantly, the request of Professor Gothiel was granted, and he placed all the material in the hands of Professor Worrell in November 1924. It is not possible to distinguish by marks the work of the two scholars, but for the final form of the volume, Professor Worrell is alone responsible. Professor Gothiel personally examined certain Genizah or Genizah documents in the Taylor Schechter Bodleian British Museum and Paris Conservatory collections, collection, and his name is therefore given with the observations bearing upon these collections. Similarly, his name is mentioned in a number of other instances in which Mr. Worrell was unable to verify sources or to express a personal opinion. Dr. Samuel Fagin Feigen worked out number, whatever that one is, independently, and that number has been printed just as it came from his pen, entirely upon his responsibility. Professor A. Marks, Professor Ginsberg, and Professor Israel Davidson, all of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, Mr. David Yellen of Jerusalem, Mr. B. Shapiro of Paris, assisted Professor Gotthiel with particular matters which have been acknowledged in their places. Mr. Leon Nimoy of Yale University, etc., etc. The heliotype plates of the volume were executed by the Heliotype Company in Boston under the direction of Mr. W.C. Ramsay. The cost of publication was defrayed from the Freer Research and Publication Fund of the University of Michigan. Writer Francis W. Kelsey, University of Michigan, July 10, 1929. And there is the contents page, the introduction, the text translations and notes. And list of plates or pictures that accompany this, that are found in this book. More list of plates. Introduction. In this footnote here, which states large Roman numerals in parentheses indicate the fragments in the Freer collection, and Arabic numerals in parentheses indicate the pages of the present volume. The Hebrew word, introduction to Cairo Genizah. The Hebrew word Genizah means safekeeping, hiding, archive, treasury, hiding place. Specifically, it means a depository where worn out, heretical, or disgraced books, written or printed, useless documents and letters or other objects of pious solicitude are stored. Genizahs among Jews and similar institutions among Christians owe their origin doubtless to the feeling that objects held by religious or personal use and association may not be destroyed even though they have ceased to be useful. Fear of profanation leads to the practice of hiding them in walls or attics. Is that like corruption or something? Or somebody's going to write some rubbish on it about it or something like that? Fear of profanation leads to the practice of hiding them in walls or attics, in the ground, or with the dead, in order that, like the beloved dead, they may remain forever safe until liberated by time under the dispensation of providence. In Europe and elsewhere, a corner of the graveyard was set apart for this purpose. For Genizah or Genizah ceremonies, it's got some reference there in French. The review of the something alliance in the French. 1901, page 103. In Europe and elsewhere, a corner of the graveyard was set apart for this purpose. There is such a place in Florence. It would be in Paris, we guess. Marked by an appropriate inscription. In the ancient Coptic Reed Monastery at Sohaj, worn out prayer books, vestments and altar paraphernalia are thrown into a pit. The theological motivation among the Jews is the protection of the divine name from desecration. Genizahs or Genizahs papers are indeed sometimes called shemoth, names. Islam shows a similar solicitude for any piece of writing or printing because it almost certainly contains the name of God. There's a footnote below. The word Genizah or Genizah has now become a proper name designating the literary limbo of the ancient synagogue of Elijah. Footnote below. Or Ezra or Moses. See also the Jewish Encyclopedia, volume 5, paragraph 60, FF, and Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, volume 6, paragraph 187, etc., etc. The word Genizah has now become a proper name designating the literary limbo of the ancient synagogue of Elijah in Old Cairo. The Genizah and its contents have had a long history which unfortunately cannot yet be written because of the incompleteness and hearsay character of the evidence. From the account of Mr. E. N. Adler in the Jewish Encyclopedia, volume 5, paragraph 612 FF, we learn that the synagogue was originally a Christian church bearing the name of St. Michael. Chosroes, partly as an enemy of the faith in Byzantium, and partly no doubt as the heir of Cyrus in 1616, turned the synagogue over to the Jews. Benjamin of Tudela visited it in the 12th century and thought it a very ancient place. The great Egyptian antiquary Al-Maqrizi AD 1364 to 1442 writes, Synagogue of the Syrians. This synagogue is in the street of Qasr al-Sham of the city of Cairo, and it is ancient. There is an inscription above its door in the Hebrew writing engraven in the wood to the effect that it was built in the year 336 of Alexander AD 24, which is about 45 years before the second destruction of Jerusalem by Titus AD 70, and 600 years before the Hijrah AD 622. And in the synagogue there is a copy of the law, which all agree to be entirely in the handwriting of the prophet Ezra. No doubt man is right, and we are to understand that the inscription read 1336 of the Seleucid era, which is AD 1024. The Jews in Egypt and in Palestine, volume 2, page 375. Simon van Gelderen at about 1750 and Jacob Sapphire in 1864. Both saw the synagogue and its Genizah and recognised the value of their treasures. Mrs. Agnes Smith Lewis tells us casually, or told him casually, that the first known Genizah leaves were brought to Europe by Dr. Lansing, but there appeared to be no support for the statement. Mr. E. N. Adler in 1888 visited the synagogue, but he did not succeed in seeing the contents of the Genizah, where he was told that they had been buried. In the early 90s, Professor Gotthiel used to see the desk of Dr. Neubauer, the sub-librarian of the Bodleian Library at Oxford, covered with portions of books which Dr. Neubauer told him had come from the East, his professional discretion not permitting him to disclose their exact source, or where he actually got them from, what location. The Bodleian catalogues makes the statement that in 1890 the Reverend J. Chester bought some leaves in Cairo for the Bodleian Library, and adds that the credit of first recognising their possible value to Hebrew literature belongs to Dr. Neubauer. In Anecdota Oxoniensia, Semitic Series Part 4 and 6, Medieval Jewish Chronicles 2, 1895, Dr. Neubauer published a chronicle which had evidently come from the Cairo Genizah. In January 1896, Mr. Adler again came to Egypt, and with the knowledge and help of the chief rabbi of Egypt, he took away a sack full of parchment and paper leaves. And it continues. On May 13th, 1897, Dr. Schechter observed in a bundle of fragments brought from southern Palestine by Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson a time-worn leaf of the lost Hebrew original of Ecclesiasticus. S. Schechter and C. Taylor, The Wisdom of Ben Sira, Cambridge, 1899, page 5. With the promptness which was characteristic of him, Professor Schechter set out immediately for Cairo with the single purpose of bringing back the entire contents of the Genizah to Cambridge. Armed with an introduction to Lord Cromer, he went to Egypt. A word from the latter to the Jewish authorities in Cairo opened up the old chamber. Professor Schechter was able to take away from him in sacks, at his own estimate, not less than 100,000 pieces of vellum and paper. He has given an account of this visit in his article, A Hoard of Hebrew Manuscripts. Studies in Judaism, 2nd series, 1908, paragraph 9, double F. He has given an account of this visit in his article, A Hoard of Hebrew Manuscripts. One doubts, however, whether Schechter brought back all that was in a Genizah. Undoubtedly, the place had been plundered before his coming. And his footnote here about his visit. It states the synagogue had been repaired sometime before Schechter's visit, most probably about 1890, shortly after which date the Genizah material Genizah material began to appear at the Bodleian. To quote from a reliable correspondent whose name cannot be mentioned, before the late Dr. Schechter transferred its remains to Cambridge, many dealers helped themselves to small bundles of fragments which they would obtain by baksheesh from the beadle of the old synagogue at Fosta, Old Cairo, where the Genizah had been discovered in the attic as a result of the work of repairing the synagogue. The workmen, on tearing down the roof, dumped all the content of this attic into the courtyard, and there the manuscripts were lying for several weeks in the open. During these weeks, many dealers could obtain bundles of leaves for nominal sums. They later sold these bundles at good prices for several tourists in libraries. But the Genizah was known in 1750 and 1864. As we have seen, and hence could not be discovered. Also, if all the contents were dumped to the courtyard, they must have been restored in part at least to the Genizah before Schechter's visit in 1897, for he found them there. In view of all these statements, perhaps the contents of the Genizah and the entrance to it were always known to the synagogue authorities. They deceived Adler upon his first visit in 1888 with a conventional answer. The contents of a Genizah are regularly buried. Before the repairs, the contents and their whereabouts were well known, but not their value. That fact appeared to the synagogue authorities only after they had seen the beadle sell to the dealers. And footnote 11, formerly in the Cyrus Adler Sulzberger, Amram Friedenwald and Coburn collections. These, together with other Genizah material in Philadelphia, are characterized by the late Dr. B. Halper in his descriptive catalogue of 1924. The Genizah documents we have thus far been examined have contributed immensely to the history of the Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in Egypt. Before the discovery, little was known of the government of the communities, their tastes and activities, their daily lives. The article, quote, Egypt, unquote, in the Jewish Encyclopedia, written in 1903, in the absence of a second edition of that work, has been overtaken by the excellent book of Dr. Jacob Mann, The Jews in Egypt and in Palestine under the Fatimid Caliphs, Oxford, 1920-22. It is hoped, however, that someday all the Genizah material will be published in the original text and with logical or chronological sequence in a corpus Genizah-corum, and that before long some bodies of scholars and some mecenas will be found to undertake the task. 2. The Freer collection. The Genizah documents edited in the present volume were purchased by Mr. Charles L. Freer of Detroit in USA in the year 1908 from a dealer in Giza. Nothing further is known of their provenance. They were probably picked up by the curious or the speculative at the time when the synagogue was being repaired. Every Egyptian knows the negotiable value of antiquities, particularly of inscribed leaves. It is, of course, also possible that they were dug up by natives after being regularly buried by the authorities of the synagogue. It is even possible that they never were in the synagogue, but that they were obtained from some ancient cemetery where they had been originally buried with the dead. The Freer collection of Genizah documents has been placed in the Freer Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution at Washington, D.C., USA. 3. The paper. All the fragments are written upon paper, and here's the numbers. Fine screen marks. They have coarse and fine screen marks. Watermarks are to be found on numbers 27, etc. The former is apparently a mailed torso, and the latter a hand and star, such as was employed by manufacturers in France, Switzerland, and Sicily between AD 1490 and 1590, according to Briquet Le Filigranes 1907. 4. The handwriting. Although some of the hands betray a familiarity with Arabic writing, 27, there is very little of Arabic writing to be found in the collection. The instances are numbers 16, entire, 27 and 35 addresses, 2 and 19, is it? Scores on the back which we have not attempted to explain. The Coptic numerals employed in number 60, we're guessing that is, not too sure not too hot on the Roman numerals, would seem to indicate some contact with the Coptic Arabic physical system. The collection as a whole is written in Hebrew characters. There is nothing remarkable in the use of the Hebrew alphabet by the Jews when writing Arabic. They have done similarly in Persia, Spain, the Slavic countries in America. So also the Greeks and Armenians used their national alphabets for writing Turkish. For a time the Jacobite Christians of the Lebanon wrote Arabic in Syriac characters, the so-called Kashuni. Just as the use of the Arabic script quite generally follows the adoption of Islam, so the use of the Latin or the Greek alphabet shows historical and cultural relationships to the Latin Church or the Greek Church respectively. It is perhaps not that the letters are more sacred than the language, but that the letters can still be taught after it becomes impossible to continue the tradition of the language. The variety and difficulty of the hands present at once the chief problem of the editors, although Hebrew writing, in the very nature of the case, is not usually so difficult as the freely litigated Arabic, and so forth. It was difficult to find a satisfactory standard for the classification of hands. The traditional terms square, half square and cursive have no definitive and generally accepted meaning. Square is used to designate the group of hands most nearly like the standard type of our Hebrew Bibles. Half square means usually the group resembling the rabbinic or Rashi type of the printers. Cursive means perhaps a running hand with ligatures, but square hands become careless and begin to look like rabbinic, while truly cursive hands can hardly be found at all. In this collection, in spite of the carelessness of many of the hands, there is only one 21 really cursive hand in the sense of being freely ligatured. Under these circumstances, it has been thought best to invent a system, if only for the purpose of this volume, and to give the three traditional terms a definite meaning. And it's continued. The square type is made with 5 strokes, half square type is made with 3 strokes, etc. etc. The dating, unfortunately only 19 of the 50 fragments can by any means be dated. Of these, the earliest appears to be number 5, around 1016, and so forth. The language and languages. The interpretation of many of the letters is made peculiarly difficult by a certain characteristic vagueness, incoherence and obscurity of language. 18. The editors are well aware of their failure in many instances to grasp the meaning of the text. 139 FF. Some of the trouble arises from pure slovenliness of thought and expression. Confusion between two possible forms of constructions which present themselves simultaneously to the mind of the writer are very common. To the obscurities of very bad Arabic, 151, and Arabic under some strong foreign influence, 33, are added the inelegancies of speech mixture. Hebrew and Arabic are often frankly combined in a single document, even of some pretensions, but Arabic and Hebrew are combined in the same words. 15. Arabic words are used in a Hebrew sense, and Hebrew words in an Arabic sense. 39, 162. And the Arabic and Hebrew articles are even combined. 104. One cannot escape the impression, however, that there is a considerable element of deliberate Geheimthuerei, whatever that means if it's in German, which probably means my lady has gone forward to you with the dogs, who will tell you about it. 19. And the elephant, God keep him, did not wish to give colours. The writer of it is the slave, your insignificant servant. Genesis to Exodus 133. Some of this is due to fear of the interception of letters, no doubt, and it's not possible for the author to explain to you, or the writer to explain to you. 151. Much of it arises from the trade slang of a forgotten age. Number 30, 6 is an excellent example of this. Some of it may be humour. Bought a slave means became the father of a son. 51. The bed is the most important thing in the house. 21. I needed first of all a tailor. 151. The elaborate ceremonial of address and letters, whether in Hebrew or in Arabic, suggests some relationship with the highly developed epistolary technique of the Arabs as set forth in such books as the Subh al-Ashar of al-Kalshandi, who died around AD 1418. The languages used are Arabic, Hebrew and Aramaic. Except in a few cases where the language is bad, we may assume that Arabic was the mother tongue of the writers of all these documents. It is used for the most of the personal letters, notes and memoranda, and documents in Hebrew have a tendency to lapse into it. Hebrew is the language of formal letters, or letters written by proficient persons with a motive or emphasizing the bond that united the Jews. Hebrew is the language of the poetic pieces, all more or less religious, and Aramaic the language of documents. 11. But words from both languages are often introduced into Arabic texts, especially where Jewish institutions are concerned. It is perhaps unnecessary, except for the completeness, to remark here that Hebrew was properly the language of Canaan. So it would be the Ugaritic, the Canaanite. Isaiah 19:18. Themselves are part of the Aramaean migration and in contact with Aramaic. Genesis 31:47, 2 Samuel 10:6, Judges 18:28. The Jews must have become more familiar with Aramaic after the deportation of Israelites and importation of Aramaeans in 734 and 722 BC. 2 Kings 15:29, etc., etc. Ezra 4:2-10. Aramaic was understood by Judeans of the upper classes as early as 701 BC. And it's in 2 Kings 18:26, Isaiah 36:11. During the 50 years of exile in an Aramaic-speaking Babylon, the Jews must have learned that language thoroughly as a steady process of Aramaization in post-exilic Hebrew testifies. The writer of Ezra, end of 4th century BC, and the writer of Daniel, about 167 BC, not only include Aramaic documents and reports, but themselves use Aramaic within the body of a Hebrew book, intended for Jewish readers. With the beginning of Hellenistic times, Hebrew seems to have perished as a spoken language. It was replaced by Aramaic and Greek. After the decline of Greek in the 4th century, Aramaic in various forms continued to be the language of Jews in the Orient until the Muslim conquest in the latter part of the 7th century AD. Medieval and modern Hebrew have so strong an infusion of Aramaic at times that they may be said to consist of a mixture of the two. This did not occur with Arabic, probably because of the greater difference between Arabic and Hebrew, although Arabic became the chief language of the Jews in the East. It talks about the Arabic. I'll give some examples. Geography. The geographical range of the document is from Aleppo in Turkey in the north to Arin in the south, and from Spain and France in the west to Colombo in India in the east. Most important is Egypt, the home of prosperous Jewry. A number of Egyptian places are mentioned, and so forth. Biography. A great many personal names appear, but most of them are not to be identified, and many of them are as indefinite as Abraham Cohen would be in modern New York, or Muhammad in Cairo. Jew and Gentile. The student of the law who refuses to invest in sugar, 193, speaks casually of a neighbour as the uncircumcised one. May his name and memory be blotted out, 191. The melancholic Abu Zubair, writing from Jerusalem, complains that a certain other Jew is found at the houses of Muslims and does not understand the difference between inside and outside, 127. A Jew excuses himself for resorting to Gentiles, 19. A proselyte is perhaps omitted in the list of Jewish taxpayers, 69. 2 Muslim formulae, praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds, 161. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, 163. Occur in one letter. Arabic script is occasionally used, and in one instance Coptic numerals,